Hi everyone. So this is our amazing panel. I think I will do a very brief introduction of everyone, names, pronouns, and their current role, and then I'll let you properly introduce the work that you're doing and why you chose to do it in this space, as you know better than anyone. So firstly, we have Jodi-Ann Wang, whose pronouns are she, her. So Jodi leads the Commonwealth Youth Climate Change Network, is a member of the UN Economic Commission for Europe's Expert Group on Resource Management, and was a G20 youth delegate for climate in 2022. And Jodi-Ann will be talking a bit about the intersection of climate finance and climate justice. We also have Sylver Eulalee Mair, whose pronouns are they, she, he. And Sylver is a Black British Caribbean queer jewellery fashion designer, art director and artist, creating works focused on shedding light on topics overlooked in life that are personal to themselves and other marginalised communities. And Sylver is a creative who will be talking about being a creative in this space and creating art and fashion built around sustainability and the environment. We also have Jack Johnson. So Jack is the co-founder of Climate Vanguard, which is a youth-led think tank empowering the youth climate movement to become a radical force for political and economic transformation. So Jack will be talking about climate research and communications as well. And then last but not least, we have Joe Davies, whose pronouns are he, him. And Joe is Joe is on the climate diplomacy, or is the climate diplomacy desk officer for Southeast Asia and the Pacific at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, specifically the Climate Strategy and Coordination Department. And Joe will be talking a bit about climate diplomacy, which is another really interesting area when we think about COP28 coming up, and all the interesting things happening in that space as well. So as I say, I think it's best if we go on the panel. Unfortunately, we only have one working mic, or we do, but I'll be using this one, obviously. So so first of all, please could you tell us a bit more about what your work is and why you specifically chose the field that you're in to create change in the climate and sustainability space. Jack, you have been gifted the mic first, so lead the way.
All right. Thank you for having us, first of all. It's really nice to be in the space and great that everyone took some time out of their Sundays to be together. It's a really awesome space and really intimate, which is really cool. And thank you to Words of Meraki for starting that. I think that's a really important context before entering this conversation where, yeah, we're talking about careers, but it's really not like about having a career in climate. It's like it's a lifelong endeavor. So we should really be thinking about it much more broadly than just careers. So I really appreciate that. Thank you for that. I guess, how did I get into working in what I do? So I'm the co-founder of Climate Vanguard, which, as Charlie introduced, is a youth-led think tank, and we particularly work with the youth climate movement, providing policy support, communication support, and convening, so to bring different groups together to organize joint strategies and campaigns and things like that. I guess the reason I got into it and ended up starting this think tank was really leaving university and seeing a complete dearth of opportunities and jobs genuinely working on system change, which I guess makes sense. The system doesn't offer living wage jobs to change it. So we decided to create our own work around it. And the reason we really wanted to work with the youth climate movement is because, I mean, we've all seen the tremendous impact and power of the youth climate movement over the last few years, but really it's a much deeper and broader movement than just Fridays for Future. And I think that when we look at social change throughout history, young people are very, very often at the forefront of that. You look at May 68 in Paris, you look at the Black Panther movement in the US, these are young people who are taking the lead on this, largely because, I mean, in climate, certainly it's our future that we're inheriting. But also young people don't have a stake in the system as it currently is, so are very willing to go out and say, fuck this, we've got to change it. And I think that's really, really powerful, and that's why we wanted to work with young people, which we see as the real sort of locomotives of change in this system. So yeah, that's how I got into it, really. And that's what we do. I think I covered everything. Yeah.
Go on, someone step up to the plate.
I'm Sylver. To reiterate, thank you for all being here, and thank you, Charlie, for having me here. I guess I'll start with how I got into it. wanted to be a lawyer for the longest time in my life. I thought that was how you make change, was to be a lawyer. And I had a very narrow-minded view of what that change could look like. And when I was 16, I was raped by a female, and that changed everything about what I thought I knew about law, how it worked, how fairness in those spaces worked, because in queer spaces, that doesn't classify as rape. The police do not have a care for 2 black queer females in those spaces. So I did a lot of self-introspection. I looked at what I was doing and how I could actually make change, and I found that art and creativity was the only space in which I could speak freely about complicated and nuanced topics without having to play to someone else's rule book, which for me was what law felt like at that time. It felt like a place that I wasn't protected in or seen in, or would never be able to authentically speak in. Obviously, being black and queer, those notions run throughout the creative industry as well. However, there's a lot easier ways to create authenticity and create change and create conversations. So essentially my kind of law interest and practice became sucked into my jewellery and art practice, and I started looking at materials and how the social and economic and spiritual and environmental contexts of these materials that we take for granted can be used to express narratives about colonialism, blackness, the environment, all of these different things, but through using the pre-existing contexts of materials that we discard and don't view as luxury to kind of subvert this nature in jewellery and fashion, that rarity and preciousness is what means something to us, because if you buy a Vivienne Westwood gold bracelet, it means nothing. Those are mass-produced things without any feeling or authenticity. But for me, the context in material and the context of given and loved and pre-purposed things, finding the meaning in that and converting that to tell stories about marginalised communities has been my focus. And yeah, so I do that across film, art, jewellery, many creative kind of endeavours. But for me it was, so my practice is called Sylver Eulalee Studio. So Sylver was about taking this silver with the I and replacing it with the Y. So it's spelled silver with a Y for that reason. So the idea was kind of to reject this individual notion of status and wealth and replace it with why and what are the intentions behind this piece. Why do you want to buy into this? Because at the end of the day, 925 sterling silver, it's meaningless, and these materials were based, to me, off the exploitation of black and brown people, but we still want to sit here and be like, this is preciousness, this is what means something, and it to me means nothing. So to me, making a piece like this, which is made from bark that I found outside and random bits from skips and other things, is a way to change that conversation. And when you speak to people and it's about art and they're looking at this thing, they're not, so with something like this, it's about derealization and rape, but when you look at it, you just think, that's a cool thing. But then suddenly you're having a conversation about these things that you didn't know were within it. But it's a lot more authentic way, I find, to connect with people through art and creativity than something that seems quite elitist, which is how I felt when I was looking at law as a space to be in. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jodi-Ann.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And also just thank you so much for having this space and holding this space for us to all come together on a Sunday afternoon and having a panel with people from various backgrounds. I think it's awesome. So for me, my name is Jodi-Ann. I'm from Canada. I am a first-gen daughter of immigrants. I think it's important to preface because that's something that really has underpinned my career and my worldview in a way. So my background is in international development, and it's a very much an interdisciplinary subject with many cross-cutting issues. And over the past 5-6 years, I've worked with immigrants and immigrants in the service industry that's adjacent to mining communities in Canada, whose livelihood very much depends on the existence of these mining communities. I've worked kind of with high schools on how to reduce energy efficiency when really none of us really knew the technical details of how to make buildings more energy efficient. And And my undergraduate and postgraduate research focused on the presence of illegal gold mining in Ghana by Chinese migrants and what that meant upstream and downstream for local communities and for the environment. So all of that kind of came together to the realization that I can talk about development and think about it as much as I want, but there's no development if there's not a habitable planet. So that's when I started kind of pivoting more towards climate and looking at the climate development nexus. But here today, I'm speaking more about finance, and quite honestly, I stumbled upon finance. I was looking for a job after graduation. I knew I wanted to work in climate policy, but I also understood from my studies that the global financial system, the global financial architecture is imbricated with structural inequalities and racism and power imbalances that has led to the way that the world is today. So I think it was out of genuine interest and just an understanding that obviously the transition will need a lot of money to make it happen. And there are a lot of powerful actors who are acting in self-interest. But how do we, I guess, not changing the system from within, but I was just curious to understand how it worked so as to kind of further my studies and broaden my worldview. So yeah, I pass it back.
Amazing, thank you so much. And finally, Joe.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to this. Honestly, this is to be on this panel with three of you is just a real privilege. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity. So I'm Joe. I'm the Climate Diplomacy Desk Officer for Southeast Asia and the Pacific in ECED, which is the Energy, Climate and Environment Directorate at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And so I'll talk very briefly about what that means, so just quite a few words, but then more importantly sort of how I sort of came to do it and sort of why. So basically, I'm in the climate diplomacy team, and what we do is we sort of coordinate the UK government's international climate diplomacy, sort of I guess in the name, but that's looking at kind of COPs and sort of international events like that at the UN General Assembly, but also kind of bilateral engagement, country-to-country engagement, and just looking at, okay, so what are the things that we globally need to achieve, and how can we kind of work together to achieve those things? And that's a kind of really high level view, but that's really kind of what drives me to do it, which is kind of leads me on to sort of why I chose that as the space I wanted to work in. I guess it's quite a, I guess we could view this as a kind of simplistic view, but it's a really deeply held view of mine, that the kind of big challenges we face in the world, and the climate being, for me, the top of those, but a whole plethora of issues we face in the world, we can't achieve them alone. A kind of medium-sized country like the UK, it doesn't matter if we did everything absolutely right. If we were trying to do that in isolation, we just wouldn't achieve the kind of global changes that we need to. So I really viewed the kind of changes I wanted to be a part of. I wanted to do that internationally. That didn't have to be at the kind of governmental level, by the way. I think activism needs to be kind of international and transnational in its nature. But anyway, I knew that I wanted to work beyond kind of national boundaries. But how did I come to do that is kind of an interesting question, because I'm sort of, one of the reasons I say it's such a privilege to be on this panel is because I'm probably one of the least kind of climate experienced people in the room. It's something I've cared about for a really long time. I've really felt that kind of climate anxiety and kind of really kind of stressed about the future, but it's also something that's really animated me, because I viewed it as this thing that we literally have no choice, but we need to achieve it, and it's something that we can all in small and big ways kind of contribute to. So it's something I've cared about for a really long time, but professionally I've only worked on for about 7.5 weeks, and it's been quite a whirlwind, to be honest. But how did I come to do that? Well, out of university I got on the civil service fast stream, which is the kind of graduate scheme for the civil service. It's not the only way into the civil service, and I'm really happy to talk about that later, but that was my entry into working in government. I knew that I wanted to work in the public sector because, to be clear, I really view these kind of things as a kind of whole of system approach, and it can't just be the government, but I knew for the kind of changes that I wanted to make, I wanted to do that on the kind of governmental, whether that's local government or national government level. I wasn't working in climate at all, actually. On that graduate scheme, you get basically no say over what you're working on. And so I was first working on employment policy. That's the government looking at basically how do we sort of decrease the unemployment rate, what can we do to create job opportunities for people and kind of support people into those opportunities, which, I found really interesting, but it just wasn't really, it wasn't climate, right, which is the thing I really wanted to work on. And this is kind of the broad point that I think the main value that I can add to a panel like this that I can kind of talk about is how I did that, and what I kind of did to make the most of that was I knew where I wanted to get to, and I knew that was working on climate, and ideally, if possible, working on climate internationally, but I knew I wanted to work on climate in some way, and so working a job that was literally nothing to do with that at all, I just thought, okay, where do I want to get to? What are the skills that I need to do to get there? because a lot of it is kind of experience and knowledge, but to be honest, a lot of it is the kind of transferable skills that you can build. And so I knew I wanted to be working in a kind of policy role. I knew I wanted to be in a role that was about kind of building relationships and working with other people. And so those were the kind of skills that I tried to develop. After that, I worked at the Ministry of Defence in a role which was actually slightly more towards climate, because there's a big kind of climate security angle there. But again, that wasn't really kind of the space that I wanted to be in, although, I mean, the work was really interesting. But then, not long into that role, and this was kind of my plan, kind of, I guess, proving the theory, was that I just saw this role going up, all the jobs that the civil service are hiring for, just on the Civil Service Jobs website, and there was this role working in the International Climate Diplomacy Team, Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and I just thought, I don't think I'm ever going to get that job. I mean, I'm so woefully underqualified for that, but honestly, I'm just going to give it a go. And I've spoken a lot with the hiring manager for that role, and I've sort of talked about why is it that I was chosen for that role that honestly I just didn't feel kind of prepared for. And I think that largely that was due to kind of my kind of imposter syndrome and those kind of insecurities that I think we all feel. But what my hiring manager really talked about was, look, we understand, as kind of referred to, actually, we understand that like the climate space can be very kind of, I don't even want to use the word elitist, I don't want to put people off, but it can feel like it's this kind of, I don't know, circle that if you're not a part of, you're not a part of, right? And there's the people who are doing particular jobs, which get them the experience to do the other jobs. And actually, that's just really not the way we should think about it. We should be looking for people who have passion, even if they don't have that direct experience, or have experience they can transfer. Anyway, so this is sort of my hobby horse that I always bore people about at parties. So I will talk about more in the panel, but thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting.
That's brilliant, thanks so much. And such interesting and different backgrounds into the climate space, which I think is really interesting. And I hope will be really valuable, because I'm sure in the room we have people who are at different stages of their own climate journeys and will benefit from hearing about how you've all worked into this space in different ways. So the way that we've structured the panel is that firstly there'll be a question to each speaker, which is basically exploring some of the issues that they are dealing with in their field on a day-to-day basis to give more insight into what their roles entail. And again, it's issues which cut across lots of different fields. And then there'll be another question for each speaker, which is more about the practical advice of moving into this space before we open up for a Q&A. So without further ado, let's move on to the questions, giving a bit of insight into what you're doing on a daily basis. So if we come to Jodi-Ann first. So in your work, Jodi-Ann, you often work with policymakers and investors on strategies to get them to net zero, or working on initiatives like that. So when you're in that role and working with these people, how do you ensure that they have an authentic commitment to this work and they're not, greenwashing or exaggerating the impact of these schemes to get votes or, make more profits, really? So how do you ensure your partners have an authentic commitment to net zero?
And that's a really great question that also kind of touch on the key of the finance sector and the troubles that they're facing in terms of kind of shifting that, greening the entire financial system and shifting it towards net zero. Like you said, my job kind of is two levers that I pull on. One is working with policymakers, and the other one is working with kind of private investors mostly. And you need to kind of go between both. You need policymakers to create that enabling policy environment that incentivizes private finance to act, but you also need the private finance to always keep going further, because you cannot just be on the back heel of someone else when financialization has kind of brought us here in the first place. And so day in, day in out, a lot of times I contemplate like the job that I have, if financialization and private finance has brought us here in the first place, can we rely on them to bring us out? Are they really the avenue that can bring us out? Especially when you think about that, British imperialism was largely acted upon interest from the city when the financial sector became bigger and bigger. But I think at the end of the day, in the current role that I am in, with all the doubts and questions that I still have in my mind, I realize it's not just about the net zero target that you committed, the alignment to 1.5 with your entire portfolio and assets. It's about showing yourself, your employees, your stakeholders, your pensioners, the governments, how you're going to do it. It's about showing, here's the target, here's how we're going to align our entire business strategy with that target. Here's how we'll change our policies around engaging with companies, advocating with governments, engaging with stakeholders who will be unjustly impacted by their actions. It's about how do we report on these progress data and metrics is a huge challenge right now for companies to report. We still haven't gotten right how we track scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, let alone thinking about how we're actually going to align with that target. We need to think about governance, board of trustees, board of directors within the company. Are their compensation actually concomitant with the delivery of the climate pledge of the company? Are we diversifying boards? Are we making sure that, can we put young people on board so we can expand that temporal view of what it means to be a sustainable company? So when I kind of think about the details of the how, you start kind of tackling that greenwashing problem alongside it. And, you know, a few weeks ago, we saw one of the stakeholders that we work with, the Church of England, divesting completely from fossil fuel in their entire portfolio. I mean, it's a long time coming. Come on, it's 2023. Finally, you're about to do that. But at the same time, it sets a precedence, and I think hopefully we're going to see more and more of that. But just to say, like, I think I'm not here to say that greenwashing doesn't exist, or in my role we try to solve greenwashing. No, it does exist, and as sad as it is. But I guess just the things that we do day in and day out that help try to kind of combat that, both by policymakers and working directly with these hopefully well-minded companies.
It's taking that holistic approach really to these strategies and schemes, and it's not being something on the side of the business. It sounds like it's changing the whole business. Yeah. Sylver, if we come to you next. So the question for you in terms of giving us an insight on your work, you know, you're creating fashion and jewelry and art around very complex topics. Like, we're talking the oppression of marginalized communities, we're talking the climate crisis, how they intersect with environmental racism. And when you have such nuanced topics like this, how do you ensure that when the viewer or the person looking at your art or fashion is interpreting it for themselves, that your narrative isn't being lost in their own interpretation or their own knowledge of these topics?
I think, firstly, with art, there is always a level to which you won't have the control on people's interpretation, but you can steer. And I think also when you try to control that too much, you end up kind of trapped in this like insular artist mentality that's like, no one understands. And so for me, I've more kind of taken the route of, I build something that is ultimately aesthetically intriguing. Never beautiful is never the aim, but intriguing is always the aim. And then people engage with it to the level that they want to engage with it. So for me, it's that, okay, if you're a craftsperson, we'll talk about the use of these materials. If you're a fashion person, we'll talk about the aesthetics of it. If you're a activist, we can talk about the meanings of it. But all of those things can intersect depending on the level to which the person wants to engage with it. However, what I've found is making these works means people are automatically intrigued to engage with it to a level where they're asking you the questions of why this and why that, because they can sense the feeling or something about the work that they are drawn to. So I guess it's kind of a game for me to trick people into, I guess, caring about these things, because at the end of the day, they think they're saying something that's like, oh, that's so cool. And then I'm like, actually, no, it's about all of this. But it's quite a fun game to play with people. And also, like, I remember spending my teenage years as a only black queer in a very white all-girls grammar school, just shouting at the walls all the time, didn't understand, like, why people didn't understand things. And I think speaking through art versus speaking with your mouth all the time enabled me to have that safety for myself also, because there is a reality to doing social justice work, doing environmental work, that the weight and the detriment often falls on the individual or the collective, which is a massive weight to carry that shouldn't fall on us. It should fall on governments and people that are actually equipped to deal with those things, not little people. But in order to protect myself from that, I've built, I guess, an ecosystem around myself that means people approach me for these conversations, or they approach me in an open mindset, because art is, to a degree, quite an open field. So people are usually willing to learn when they're engaging with something. maybe not to the level that I hit them with, but yeah, it's really interesting to see how people kind of move with that. But I leave it in their hands, and I think that's important, because if I was just turning up in every space and saying trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma, like, there's a point where people disconnect from you. They don't feel like they can relate to it, and especially when you're dealing with black or white issues, there's a degree to which white people haven't experienced half the things that I will talk about, and that isn't their fault. It's just the way the world works. So I don't want to scare people into engaging, because I think you'll never have a real conversation with them if they're scared, or if you're activating white fragility automatically, you can never have an authentic conversation. But if the part that I've activated through my work is the part of your brain that's intrigued or open, then we can move forward and we can have a conversation about something that no one really expected to be the conversation. So yeah, it's definitely, I think, for me, a more authentic and safe way to do that. I think there's a lot of, for me, I don't view the traumas, or whatever you want to call it, or experiences that go into my work as traumas. I view it as life. There's light and there's shade, and I think the minute you put things into these categories of, we can't speak about this because it's this, we can't speak about this because it's this, all your doors are getting shut off. And to me, it's just opening that conversation, being authentic in that. And I think that in regards to, like, the climate side of my work, it draws people in because it's not overt, and I don't sit here and say, I'm a sustainable fashion designer doing X, Y, and Z. It's about material, it's about the why, it's about the essence of these things, not about, which in fashion is the reality, sticking a greenwashing label on something and calling it sustainable when your people practices aren't sustainable, or your fabric isn't actually sourced sustainably, you've just tracked it to a degree that you can market it as sustainable. So I don't really want to be involved in those conversations, because I think a lot of the designers in those spaces, they're doing it from not a place of wanting to make change and wanting to make a difference. They're doing it from a place of wanting their work to be more marketable and wanting to capitalise on a moment that cares about sustainability. There's a very big difference between those two things, and for me, I want to stay in the place of making change, being at the essence of it. Sustainability is a key factor in that, but it's integrated in a way that I don't see it as sitting here being a sustainable designer. I'm a designer, but that is my context, and I won't work outside that. But it's more about the conversation, and in regards to that, talking about sustainability of people and the sustainability of the materials I'm working with as well at the same time.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much for that in-depth answer. Jack, if we come to you next, I mean, a lot of your work is communicating also in a slightly different way, but also a lot of the ideas that your think tank are looking into and communicating, as you say, are about political and economic transformation, which for a lot of people in society are still very radical ideas they might not have even heard about, let alone got to the point of supporting. So I suppose the question for you is, when you're working, how are you building the democratic mandate to implement these ideas, which at the moment are very radical? How do we get to that point that we can implement them?
Yeah, for sure, that's a good question. I think the first thing I'd say is that young people, by and large, are very radical. We recently did a report looking at mapping the youth climate movement, so 292 different groups, and much over half of the groups identify the system as the problem, and 90% of those groups identify capitalism and colonialism specifically. So we're seeing a generation of young people who are growing up at a time where it's like hard not to radicalize in this time, in this era. So that's the first thing that helps our communication, because we're speaking to ears that are willing to listen. I think the other thing that's really important when you're talking about system change, you're talking about radical ideas, is framing it not as the politics of less, which I think the climate movement has really been guilty of, but actually framing it as the politics of more. So these transformations will make your life better. The vast majority of people's lives will improve under those types of transformations that we're talking about. Like, do you want to decommodify some of the key elements of life, universal basic services across housing, transport, healthcare, education? These are things that will make people's lives better. So I think that framing system change in those terms, rather than framing it as like yeah, you'll have to reduce your energy consumption, things like that, which scares people in very legitimate ways, I think is really important. And I think the climate movement's getting better at that. I mean, you see that even with the campaign, which doesn't exist anymore, but with Insulate Britain talking about, we'll insulate your homes. The government will insulate your homes, so you'll be warmer and you have to pay lower energy bills. Like, that's absolutely something that people are on board with. So I think communicating in those terms is really, really important. And then I think the final thing probably is that the sort of antagonisms between our current system and climate breakdown are just becoming so obvious that people really can't support the status quo anymore. I mean, we're living in a cost of living crisis. We're buttressing 1.5 degrees heating, and the fossil fuel industry is making record profits. So, like, how do you square those contradictions? I think it's becoming really difficult for people to accept that anymore. And so I think that that context also helps the communication and makes people more open to other types of politics and other types of transformation. Yeah.
Great, and that's very exciting to hear as well, and reassuring to hear that young people's views are much more aligned with where we need to be than perhaps other generations. Joe, if we come to you next. So you work in climate diplomacy, and at the moment we're seeing this transition in the international space away from openness that we've had over the last couple of decades towards more protectionism, towards working with allies, international mistrust and suspicion. How does that change the role of a climate diplomat? What different tools and techniques you need to be implementing, and how we build international solidarity around the climate movement when we're, as I say, transitioning away from openness towards closed boundaries and suspicion on the global stage?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think can you hear me? Yeah, cool. I have to preface it by saying about 7 weeks into my job, so I haven't quite got the full answer to that just yet, but we're working on it. No, it's actually a really important question, and I think actually I want to echo a lot of what we just heard on the domestic space. I think it's actually just as true in the international space. I think if you look at what UK government's kind of 3 top international climate and environment priorities are, they are halving global emissions to keep 1.5 degrees within reach, they are halting and reversing biodiversity loss, and they are adapting to build climate resilient societies. Now, if you look at those 3 things, you have to ask yourself, well, whose interest are they not in? I mean, I'm talking on the national level. It's like, actually, those are global goods. Those are things which actually are in all of our interests. And again, some might sort of hear my naivety or my sort of, idealism coming in, but I do sincerely believe those are things that are within our power to convince everybody. It's not about us convincing, it's about people around the world convincing each other that that's in all of our interests. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a really kind of, it can be a really concerning thought to think that these things that we need to achieve internationally are happening at a time where, well, we kind of don't have to go into all the details, but there's various kind of geopolitical shifts that are making the world more kind of divided, more fragmented, and more kind of adversarial. But again, I think you can look at, without trying to go into kind of too much of a history essay, you can look at periods throughout history where there is competition, there is suspicion, and yet there's recognition of shared interests and kind of global goods. And I think fundamentally, speaking to kind of any particular actor, you could win, any kind of conflict or competition, but if you're winning a planet which is uninhabitable, what's the point of that? And I don't think that's just my perspective. That's certainly not just a British perspective. A heartening thing to understand is that's actually the perspective of people all across the world, even countries that we certainly don't see eye to eye to on other issues. And so, yeah, I honestly think, just as in the domestic space, it's about not saying tomorrow is going to be worse, because, I broadly think, it's not my job to get too into domestic politics, but it's hard to convince people to support something, when our kind of vision is kind of sad, basically. We do need a kind of positive, hopeful vision. And I think we can construct, and we are constructing, that positive, hopeful vision internationally as well as we are domestically. If I could add kind of one more note on it, again, being very specific that in my role as kind of a public servant, our job is to sort of serve the government of the day, and that's a really important constitutional principle. And so it's not up to us to have, or it's not for us to kind of publicly express any kind of political views. But I think this is an important, non-partisan point to make constitutionally, that fundamentally the government, its job is to reflect its people. Right? And so I think you can, whatever your politics, we should all be encouraging everybody to the issues that you care about. It's to be talking about that. It's to be talking to your neighbours, talking to your representatives, because that's the way, the Foreign Office, our job is to kind of represent the views of the government internationally. The government should be representing the views of its people, and we have sort of systems to make sure that happens. So if this is something you care about, then you need to be kind of active in that space.
Wow, another great answer. And so interesting to hear about. I mean, it's true when you think about it, about how diplomacy is really built from the ideas happening nationally and what's going on domestically. I mean, it's just fascinating getting these insights into your work, but also kind of picking out how these are themes which really are cross-industry, whether we're talking about authentic change being holistic change, or about, you know, starting climate conversations by meeting people where their interests are and creating intrigue, or, you know, spotting generational trends and creating the climate, showing that the climate is, or the climate space, has the potential for new opportunities and you know, to improve people's lives, and building solidarity nationally to build it internationally. These are such interesting ideas, and one of the reasons I love working in the climate space is that you're dealing with these big questions. But if we move on to the next section of the panel, which is about practical advice about how to do the work that you're doing now for people in the crowd who you know, might want to move into the climate space or take an existing career and give a climate angle to it. And I'll say before we go into the questions as well that, you know, as I say, a lot of these ideas are cross-cutting, so if someone else has a question or gives an answer that you want to jump in on, please do. Like, we can make it conversational if you want to contribute as well to other people's questions. But Jodi-Ann, if we start with you again. So my question for you is that in terms of the traditional professions like finance and like law as well, there's this depiction of them that they're dominated by older white men, which I think can put off a lot of people from going in, that they feel like they're not going to be respected or that there won't be people like them in those sectors. So as a young woman of colour pushing a climate agenda, what are the tools and techniques you implement to work in that space, and also to get the recognition that your experience and qualifications deserve when you're operating in that space?
I think first off, I want to say it's definitely not a depiction, it's reality. I was even just to like anecdotally, I was in Paris 2 weeks ago for the Macron Summit, which, if you're interested in development and climate finance at all, it's definitely a movement that you should watch right now. The Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, has put forward the Bridgetown Initiative, which will take an overhaul of the entire global financial system that we're in, help us redefine what development and climate and the nexus of those means. So I was there. Anyways, I highly encourage everyone to kind of look into it. But I was there and I was at a round table and I walked in, and there's not a single person that looked like me, and I was by far, I pulled down the average age of that room by like 10 years at least. It was just so odd for me to be there. So it's very much still a reality. And I think even now in my current job, I think I'm still the youngest person at my level, and it's just going to be the way that it is. But and in the first maybe 6-7 months of when I first started working full time, I think I kept on telling myself, you know, you need to know more technical stuff than the person next to you in order for people to take you seriously. And as sad as it is, I still feel like sometimes that's true, and you kind of like know your audience and flex your style and all those kind of like, if I were here to give a very diplomatic answer, that would be it. But I think since then, what I've realized is I was kind of putting away that, oh yeah, like I'm also part of the youth climate movement. I was putting that hat away. I was taking that off when I walked into the office. And then someone was like, why am I doing that? And I think a lot of it is because we feel like people don't take young people seriously, partly because the system that we live in is not designed for youth to meaningfully engage in these political processes. But there's nothing wrong with them feeling like, oh yeah, you know, like the young people are speaking. Oh, that's like, it's, you know, it's a bit infantilizing. But I think we can use that as a leverage as well. If there's a space, I'm going to take it up. If there's a space for me, I'm going to fill it up with whatever I have because I earned it, I'm going to be there. And I think a lot of times thinking about that. And also just know, and so being proud of like that I'm part of the youth climate movement. And I will say something from my perspective, because that's my lived experience, and that when we're working on an issue like tackling the planetary crisis, it's intergenerational. So you have to kind of hear what I say. Like, and if your decision-making time frame is only from now until you retire, which is probably 10, 15 years from now, then you're doing your children and grandchildren, your future generation, a disservice. And at some point, I just kind of let go of what was holding me back and just started saying those things in the meetings. And of course, I 100% recognize that it is a challenging step, and it took me a long way to get there. But owning that kind of, yeah, I am the youngest person in this room, and I'll say something. Like, owning that part of my identity was I think quite exhilarating. And also, just my job doesn't define who I am. Yeah, I work in kind of climate finance, but so much of the youth climate movement outside of work is actually making climate finance more accountable to the younger generation. So it's also part of me feeling like I'm repenting my sins for working with investors so much, like day in and day out, but at the same time using both as levers, I guess. And it goes back to the first question of like avoiding greenwashing as well. I think it's knowing that I can play different roles within the climate sphere. Yeah, I think that's been quite helpful.
That's a really interesting answer. Does anyone else have anything else they want to jump in on there in terms of, you know, getting the recognition you deserve as a young person in that space? Yeah.
Very similarly, I'm always like at least a decade younger than the people in the rooms that I'm in, and I think also as a POC person you have to manage the sometimes stereotype and sometimes truth that there is a tick box being ticked somewhere, and managing knowing that you deserve to be in that room, but equally knowing that that box somewhere probably exists is a hard thing to exist in. But I think the key is just to not make it your problem, and to know your worth, I think, was the most... I went out and found every back door into the industry because I was told that, oh, you'll never exhibit there until you're 45, you'll never do this until you're this, you'll never achieve that. And now I look at my tutors and I show them my CV and I go, well, I did all of it and I'm 22, so what's your point now? Like, what? But understanding that also those people, a lot of the people at the top, they want to remain there and they want to keep their wealth and they want to keep their power. So unless you've got the tenacity to go in the back doors, it's hard, and you'll just feel a lack of soul from constantly bashing down these front doors that ultimately never want to let you in. But going around the back door and just knowing that you are meant to be there and you're really meant to be there a lot more than a lot of these people, their insecurity comes from the fact that in reality they weren't meant to be there. They got it through a connection, or they got it through some luck, or they got it through X, Y, and Z. That means they don't have the substance to back up their power, and they know that you do, and they're threatened by that. And in that knowledge, there is immense power to occupy and take up the space that you deserve. And I think whatever demographic or whatever roadblocks you've experienced in that journey, it's the most key thing to, even if you can't get the legitimacy of a brand partnership signing off whatever work you're creating, get your friends, get your people, and just create. Like, there's a really inspiring filmmaker called Gabriel Moses who just shot the Louis Vuitton men's campaign with Pharrell, but he started with his group of friends who are footballers, and he made a film about them, and then Nike saw that film, and then he was directing films for Nike, and then that's the trajectory. But it's about, if you know inside your power, then just do whatever it takes to get that power out there and keep doing that until someone like a brand name says, okay, we'll give you this legitimacy. And really you only need that one piece of legitimacy to go. And so I think it's a balance of getting legitimacy, but also knowing your own worth, whether you have it or don't have it as yet.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think Jodi-Ann wants to jump back in.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to add one thing that on the back door, front door analogy. I think there's, especially within, when I walk into a space and I see a lot of like youth advocates of color, it immediately feels empowered. But on that, you know, when you get the way in to a space, it's so important to hold the door open, and it's so important to hold that space open for other people to also bring in and to diversify a space. So yeah, I just wanted to add that as well, because I think that's something that not a lot of people have held the door open for each other in the finance space, and that's the reason why we are partially, as from a human capital perspective, that's kind of the reason why we're here. So with the newer generation kind of coming in and making the space more sustainable, it's so incredibly important to hold the door open for other people as well.
I completely agree, and the same within law. I mean, they were holding the door open, but they were holding it open for certain people that were like them and thought like them. And yeah, I completely agree that we need to be advocates for diversifying all the sectors that we're in. I mean, Sylver, the question I had for you next, you kind of answered already, which was about, I mean, you might want to build on it again, so I'll ask it anyway. But it was basically for creatives. I'm not a creative, so this is kind of the impression that I guess people have. is that it can be hard to get work and build up your portfolio. So I wanted to ask whether you find, in trying to build your portfolio and trying to build your career, you ever find yourself being forced to compromise your principles or your ideas around sustainability, or to what extent those things do conflict. But I mean, you've given us such a great answer already about different ways that you can build up your portfolio. But if you have anything you want to add, please do.
I think, yes, the two things definitely compete with each other in the jewellery world. Like I've said, scarcity and rarity is how people build their value that they're putting into something. But so in terms of that, jewellers and artists, there's all these words like, is it costume jewellery, is it fine jewellery, is it contemporary jewellery, is it fine jewellery? Those are all just fluff that people put on things to tell you the price point or the worth of your work. So I'd say whatever industry you're in, find out what those words are, because there's always words somewhere that are being used to like control or put you into some context. And often the issue is that people don't see those contexts before it's too late, and they've already built something that now isn't what they actually align for. So I've always kept, like, in terms of how I make and the jobs I take on, very, very, very authentic to me, which makes my life a lot easier, because it means that people who aren't interested in my sustainable practice in film, they aren't interested in using old fabrics and using things from charity shops to build their feature films. If they're not interested in that, then they just simply don't approach me, and I don't have to have that conversation. But I try to make every space that I go into, I prove that you can work sustainably, even with these big budgets, or that it's an asset to work sustainably, that you don't have to, it doesn't mean that your set is going to look crafty because I used plywood that was from some old like shop or something, as opposed to plywood from Leyland's. Like, those things aren't, I think in art and spaces like that, everything is about the money of it. When you actually look at it, people like McQueen, their first collections were cling film that they found on the floor and then put a zip in and sent it down the runway. It's about how you handle something and how you deal with something that really puts the meaning and the wealth and all of that into it. And I think the fashion industry and jewellery industry are just generally a bit lost in the way that they look at things, because you've got people like McQueen that are held up as these idols, but at their core, and when they started, they were sustainable designers. He was using whatever he could find to make this thing work. And now you're in a place where these art schools, that a lot of the students and the teachers and the sponsors all have this level of wealth and disconnection from the art, and it's just this place of really egos. Like, if you walk into a lot of art spaces, it is just ego and chatting rubbish a lot of the time. And for me, I think the biggest struggle is how do I say this without being troublesome? In an institution like the one I'm in, where they'll tell you, okay, we're doing this brief, you need to work with your old biscuit tin and make a ring out of it. But then the sponsors that they'll bring in are the LVMH group, Stone Island, EE, all of these massive corporate sponsors that are completely the opposite of what these people are telling you to make your work like. And I think it's about learning that realistically those people in those places aren't telling you the truth, and you don't need to listen to them. It's all under this sea of greenwashing, or just, it's ultimately about the money. So you've got to prove, what I try to prove to people is that the money, the couture, the luxury is all still there if I'm using sustainable materials. The luxury is what we experience every day. The luxury of throwing a Red Bull can is still a luxury that's been produced and has artisan qualities to it. Like, those are luxury objects, and if we view luxury like that instead of the gold and the silver and the gemstones that we've dragged out of the ground of exploited people's lands, that's not luxury, that's exploitation. We already have all of the luxuries here. We just need to change the way we view them and the way we use them.
I'm glad I still asked that question. Yeah, jump in, please.
Sorry, yeah. yeah, I just wanted to quickly answer. That was a fascinating answer, by the way. I'm always fascinated to hear about kind of creative industries and people doing creative things. So thank you for sharing. No, I just wanted to add on the point of kind of having to take work which doesn't like maybe completely align with your principles. Like, now, that's not something I can like kind of personally speak to, and not actually in the creative space. But what I can speak to is kind of having to do jobs which like they're not in conflict with your principles, but they're just like not your principles. You know, they're just not the things that you want to be doing. And I think this is the thing that I've thought about a lot at university. Sorry, yeah, a lot since university, working on a lot of kind of social mobility kind of stuff like that. Is that I think there can be this, I don't know, almost, I sometimes think of it as this kind of aristocracy, right, of people who, for different reasons, like are able to kind of leave university and just wait for the right thing, right, and maybe like do a bit of, you know, kind of unpaid internship stuff, and like, you know, they just want to work at a cool like think tank or whatever. And I've spent a fair bit of my time at university and since university quite jealous of some of those people who didn't have to do a job because they needed to pay bills, basically, you know, could wait till it was the job that was the one that would look perfect on their CV. I've had to do like a few different things, right? Some of which I've absolutely loved, some of which I haven't absolutely loved, and until now, none of them have been exactly what I want to do. And what I've really tried to do when I'm doing jobs that, you know, maybe to be fair, I quite enjoyed them, but they didn't feel like they were directly putting me on the path to kind of work on the kind of international climate stuff that I knew that I wanted to. So I know I've kind of already touched on this, but I was just thinking all the time, okay, and this sounds a bit kind of LinkedIn corporate, but it wasn't really thinking of it that way, but it was just thinking, okay, I'm doing this job because, you know, this is the job that I have to be doing right now. How can I be making this, you know, the equivalent of that job that would look so good on my CV when, to be frank, I don't know if this job necessarily does, but what are the jobs that I wish I was doing right now? What are the things that I can do in my current job that would be similar to that, to kind of give me the experience to do stuff later on? So I think it can be really disheartening, and I don't want this to be the case because I now have like a job title that I'm like really proud of. I did sometimes find it a bit disheartening when I kind of went to careers panels and kind of spoke to people who were doing jobs that I just really wanted, and then I like heard the jobs they did before that, and I was like, yeah, but I don't get how you got that job straight out of uni, right? And it's because I didn't have the right connections or whatever. And it's something that I really, really want to impress upon people, and I really talk about all the time, is like not trying to ignore all of those advantages that people have, but trying to do what you can that's in your power to create those opportunities for yourself. And yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Great, thank you for contributing that as well. Jack, if we come to you next. So to you, I wanted to ask a question about building a climate network, which I think is something a lot of people struggle to do when they first come into the space. And we need our networks to send us opportunities and re-energize us. But especially starting a think tank, you have built up, you know, followers both online and offline. You've also, you know, found collaborators to work on projects with, and you've also found people to mentor you. And these are all very different relationships. So could you maybe give us an insight into how you build these relationships, how you foster them, and continue to grow your climate network?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is probably like one of the most important things that during the work I've done has like, taught me or brought to me, is just like reaching out to people constantly. Like that was the first few months of building this organization. We were just constantly cold calling people, even people we thought we'd never talk to. We just email them with our project and ask for their input and insight. And I think that that's like one of the biggest learnings, is how welcoming people are in this broader conceived climate space. And people have a genuine interest in more young people coming in and like really want to be supportive and helpful. And so I'd really encourage people not to be afraid of just like reaching out to people and being, even if you think you'll never talk to them, you'd be really, really surprised who will respond and who will give you a half-an-hour conversation. And that just snowballs from there. I mean, you ask them, can I get in touch with anyone that you know? And it's just like this kind of avalanche of different contacts and whatnot. But I think like, yeah, looking back on that, I was not the type of person who would be really into like networking or talking to people before this work. But starting the organization really required that. And I think that that's something that's been really, really beneficial, and something I still do all the time, like reaching out to people I have no idea who they are. I just like respect their work, and they much more than not will answer, and we can set up a call and talk, and people are super, super welcoming. So even if it makes you uncomfortable, I'd really, really encourage people to do that. And come from like an authentic place of like, people obviously really like helping young people as well. And use that, like kind of what you were saying, like use the fact that you're young for sure. Be like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. And people love like giving input and advice. And like, I'm super serious about that, yeah. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Perfect. Does anyone else want to jump in on that, building a climate network? We're reflecting. That's okay. That's a great answer. Thank you. And finally, we'll come to Joe. And you've mentioned a few times now how you're relatively new to working in climate, I think like 7 weeks. And I think anyone who's like been looking into this space knows that it can be so complex, so technical. I mean, you're both trying to, I think, build up your like scientific knowledge of what the climate crisis is to talk about it, and then also building up your knowledge of climate policy and climate diplomacy. And it's this massive space where there's lots of different people, entities, facts, ideas moving around. So with all that in mind, how have you built up your climate knowledge to be able to work in the space, confidently speak about this space? What resources have you used even? Maybe give us an insight into that.
Sure, yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, to be honest, I'm going to echo much of what we just heard actually, because I think the number one way that I have learned, and this is again something that I've really learned in the last couple of years, is the kind of networks that are out there. And I'm not really a kind of natural networker. Like the idea of sort of going into a big room of people with canopies just absolutely terrifies me. Just hilarious given the job that I've chosen, because that's a large part of it. But no, it's not something that came that naturally to me. But what I really learned is that people are passionate about the stuff that they're working on, especially in the climate space, right? This is a thing that people came to work on because they understand it's an emergency, and they feel all the kind of feelings that I feel and that I guess we all in this room kind of feel. And so what I've really found is that when I've gone to those people and said, hi, I've got this amazing new role, I'm so excited to learn on it, I've got a lot of passion, a lot of enthusiasm, but to be honest, just not a huge amount of experience, and I feel like a real kind of shortfall of knowledge. I've been a bit nervous at first to do that because I thought, are they going to think, I don't know, the sort of jumped up guy, like, why is he kind of coming to me wanting me to share that knowledge? It's literally not the reaction I've ever received at all, actually. I've had conversations with people sort of across the climate movement, young people, more experienced people, people in think tanks, people in different parts of the government, people in charities, who are just really happy that I want to speak to them. And I've had some fascinating conversations and just kind of scribbled notes. So that's honestly my kind of number one thing. And that's not just because of the kind of job title I have now, by the way. That's like, it's actually just what I've really learned is that, because it's the same for me. If someone comes to me and says like, oh, I'm really interested in working in climate diplomacy, like, how do you do that? Guess what? I actually quite enjoy talking about that because I chose this job because I like it, and it's kind of cool when someone else likes it too. It's just a kind of natural human response. And so, honestly, just use the kind of networks that are there. I think there's the broader point actually, which is that, and we were talking about this before the panel actually, that I think I had this perspective that, like, I don't know, I really cared about climate, and I did kind of what I could to make more sustainable decisions in my life, and kind of research and have conversations with family members and whatever. But I kind of, in my head, there was this kind of delineation between people like me who cared about climate and some of my friends who were more in like the climate movement, right? And I was always almost nervous to say like, yeah, I care about climate, because I was always worried someone was going to be like, well, what do you think about this? Have you read this paper? And I'd be like, oh God, I actually haven't. And it's like, what I really learned reading a lot of stuff now and speaking to a lot of experts, and certainly not being an expert yet myself, but having a lot more of a knowledge base than I did a couple of months ago, is honestly like, I'm not that much more, like my voice isn't more important now than it was 3 months ago. And that's not some kind of anti-intellectual like campaign to like not research things. I think it's really good to challenge your ideas and have more evidence for when you're discussing things with people. But honestly, the rough gist that I had before is pretty similar to the more detailed knowledge that I have now. And again, the reason that I kind of really want to bring that point out is because I don't like kind of gatekeeping. I don't like this anti-democratic idea that only people with a degree in a subject should be the people debating that subject. The point of democracy is that kind of we all have our opinions, and we can all kind of voice our opinions. And so, yeah, that's how I kind of have learnt myself, is by leveraging that network. And I encourage everybody to do that, but also not to feel like you need to have read every scientific paper on the effects of climate change and the causes of climate change to actually speak about the climate policies that you care about.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that. That's a pretty comprehensive answer. But I think maybe we can move on to the Q&A section of the panel. If anyone, we've heard so many interesting ideas and perspectives. So if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask, we can get a microphone to you. I have your questions from when you got your ticket, so I will start randomly picking people if no one says anything. Does anyone want to ask a question? Maddie, I'm looking at you.
Oh my God.
It's like a game show. Do you remember your question?
I do, yeah.
No.
Okay, sure.
I wasn't joking.
Okay, first of all, that was amazing. Like, you guys are so smart. I have a job where I'm a journalist. I have to interview a lot of older people, and like, you're so much smarter. Like, or as in, you're just much more like, you're thinking about the whole picture, like a lot more than a lot of people in charge are, if that makes sense. Anyway, though, my question was, okay, so yeah, so it's interesting because, so I was looking at you guys. So you write with like finance. Sorry, you work in finance, and you work in government, and then you set up like a think tank, and you're an artist. So like, I was thinking about like your scales of impact. So which I was just thinking it was interesting because it's like, you could accuse the UK government of doing a lot of bad things. You could accuse maybe the investors you work with of doing a lot of bad things, and I think I'm getting the impression that you agree with me that yeah, they probably have both done lots of awful things. But like, I was wondering what you guys thought about if you're like working in a really big institution that may have done a lot of bad things, but it's really big and it's not going away anytime soon. Like, it's not going away anytime soon, and it's trying to transition like towards being better socially and environmentally. Like, how do you compare that to like the impact you're having when you're sort of working in a much smaller scale, but it's like, you know that you started it from scratch and like it's been purely like ethical from the scratch. Sorry, yeah, so my I guess my question was like, do you think that like, how do you compare your levels of impact with each other? It's not a competition, but like, I just thought that's what I was wondering. Sorry.
Yeah. Kind of like better to be in the system creating change, or be outside the system
or
creating change.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we do have kind of two people who are more in established like roles and two people who are kind of outside of it. So what are your perspectives on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and honestly one that you know, it's firstly really good to ask searching questions, right? Yeah, no, that's really good, and I think it's a really important question for us to all think about, right? People who, whether it's, I guess in this room we all care about climate, but whether you care about climate or other social issues or economic issues, whatever it is, you have to ask yourself, you know, am I going to make the most change, as you say, kind of trying to work on the changes that you agree with within an organisation, or trying to kind of be the reason those changes are happening outside of it? And I'm going to give, it might sound like a wishy-washy answer, but it's my genuine belief is that is something that each of us have to kind of philosophically decide, right? Because I don't actually believe there's a difference in impact. I mean, this is just my kind of philosophical view of it, is that, and I kind of view it this way, because I've talked about this a lot with my friends, is that if everybody went to work in the government, right, and there was nobody outside of it, literally no change would happen at all, right? Because the government is just always going to reflect kind of what's being pushed for. And so if there's nobody outside of the government pushing it to change, it's not going to change at all. But if nobody who cared about a particular issue went to work in the kind of established organisations, everybody was outside of it. Again, I might be wrong here, but I'm not actually convinced that the change would happen in the way that they want it to. Because I do believe that you need to be, you know, whenever you want anything to happen, you need people inside of a system who are kind of working on the changes that they believe in. So that's kind of my view, is that honestly it's whichever one you philosophically believe. That sounds a bit wishy-washy. The kind of more specific thing that I can say is you just have to think about, I almost think about this like in terms of your life, like what's the thing that's going to kind of motivate you and make you feel good? Because I've done roles where I'm working on like a very, very specific thing, not actually in the climate sector, but I'm working on a very specific thing. So I have like a huge amount of responsibility for it, but like ultimately, you know, some of those things I worked on made a tiny, tiny difference, right? And I've worked on other things where like I'm working on this thing which, you know, collectively 1,000 people are working on that is uber important, but I'm like 1,000th of it. And I haven't quite decided which of those kind of animates me more and makes me feel better. What I can say is that at the moment I'm really enjoying working in like a big established organisation and kind of, you know, being part of that mission that I believe in. But I really, really believe that, you know, it's really important that there are people who believe the things they believe working outside of those institutions. But,
yeah, that's a really good question. I'm trying to organise my thoughts because I have a lot to say on it. I think the first thing is, I would echo what you just said, is that I think we need people everywhere. And that's not like a cop-out like we generally do. I think there's this this kind of drive to kind of figure out or find some kind of silver bullet solution, like this is the thing that everyone should be working on. And I think that I definitely feel this in my life, like there's this constant questioning of like, am I actually doing the most? Am I going to the root cause of the problem? And I think there's always a feeling of insufficiency there. But I think that it's important to have people across all sets of society pulling in the same direction. And I also think there's like a component of what you were discussing earlier, like you also need a living wage job in this world. Like that's a real thing. You need to be able to pay your bills. And so I think like there's also a realism there, like I need a job. And like obviously a lot more jobs are offered in these more established spaces. And so that's like a real thing. But I think even if you are in these more established spaces that move slowly and are sometimes actually sliding backwards, I don't think that should, I think what's important is to remain curious and continue to question yourself and your kind of strategy, your theory of change and things like that. Because I think what becomes damaging is when people start to feel attached to their job and like feel like this is the most important thing, even when it's really not. And it's okay to be in a job and be like, actually, I recognize that there are other things that are important as well. And I think there's a propensity, particularly you see this with like governments and politicians speaking, sort of trying to describe like, yeah, we're doing everything we can. It's like, no, you're not. And I'd appreciate if you're honest about that. And that would put us in a much better place than lying about it. So it's a bit of a confused answer, but that's what I've got.
It's really, I mean, that question actually came up at a dinner party one time with friends, and we asked each other, like, if you could take one job right now, what's the most impactful job that you can do? And one friend said, you know, like, I want to start a EV company. I want to, you know, unleash millions of electric vehicles on the road. It's like, well, you can't really EV your way to net zero. There's huge implications for mining up and down the supply chain. And then someone said, well, I want to be the chief sustainability officer of, I don't know, Shell. And it's like, okay, well, that's you, one person. How long is it going to change? How long is it going to take to change that entire government? One person said, well, I want to be a journalist. But it's like, okay, who's going to read your work? Is it, you know, is it politicized? Which part of the spectrum? You know, questions like that. So in conclusion, I mean, there isn't one single job. If there's one institution or one single job that can take us out of this planetary crisis, we wouldn't still be here. And at the same time, the crisis that we're facing, not just climate change, but like the poly crisis that we're facing, is so huge that you know that every single actor, every single institution, every single organization will have to play a part. So I don't think it's really about who has more impact than who, but whose impact will influence the next person. The finance industry will influence the government policies will influence corporations and businesses and people. And so when you said, like, imagine if you're, you know, the head of a large company, immediately my mind is not thinking about, like, the power that I have, but then so many working class people in a huge company, and what does the transition look like for them? So there's impact at various levels if you think about who you're beholden to and how much influence you can have and how much of that dominoes effect you can kick off. Again, I didn't really answer your question either.
No. I think I'm very much a outside person, but keep one foot in the door is what I'd say. So like always make sure you can hear what the conversation is inside. But I think, to be honest, that wasn't a decision I made. I think it was the decision my general presentation made for me, that being on the inside was not the place that I was meant to be. But I think in terms of like impact, I think for me, I want to build something that's big. I'm coming for LVMH, I'm coming for you. That's kind of my thing. I want to change the conversation in that space. So definitely a larger impact is my aim in that very metric sense. However, I think that there's exceptional artisans and generally creators that have created things that, like you said, like impact the next person and impact the next person. And if you don't want to build this massive empire that has this impact everywhere, but you're making something that a student that has that sees, researches your practice, and then they're like, oh my god, I can do this, like impacting like that. I also think like being inside is not for everyone, and I think you can stay outside and gain your knowledge and your ability there, and then come at the people inside and say, actually, I know X, Y, and Z, so we can have a conversation. I think my fear was always getting sucked into being on the inside and never being able to get out. So I was very much like, I'm going to stay out. But on the flip side of that, there's always a balance. Like, I went to grammar school, I'm at Central St Martin's, I'm in these institutionalised spaces that have the big names and have the big money that I can say some things about, but not everything about. And there's always going to be a balance between serving the bigger picture. I think always service the bigger picture. If that means being in the inside, it means being in the inside. If that means being in the outside, be on the outside. But yeah, just having an awareness and an ability to switch between both. There's a really interesting artist and designer, just generally creative, Samuel Ross, who was the prodigy of Virgil Abloh and Kanye West. And he speaks so incredibly, but he describes himself as a mediator between two worlds, which I've always found a very fascinating context. Essentially, he was raised in very white spaces and received a certain amount of education, but also, on the flip side of things, had his friends getting arrested for dealing and going to jail and all of those kinds of things. So how can you mediate between those two spaces and bring those people together and see the commonality, and that if we all actually talk to each other, it's fine. But I think having the ability to stand on your own, but also having the ability to play the game in the spaces you need to play the game in, is the most important thing, because anyone who says they're a like full outsider is lying, because you have to play the game to a degree to get ahead. But I think you should always have your boundaries set before you start playing as to where you can and can't be pushed past, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Brilliant question, Maddie. Well done.
Really
And amazing answers as well. That's fascinating. That's really interesting. I have an eye to time, so unless there's a brief question from the audience that anyone wants to ask, I think hopefully the speakers will hang around for a little bit afterwards. Oh, we have a question.
A brief one.
Yeah.
What's your favourite quote?
Interesting question. And while you're thinking about that, I'll give you a couple minutes to say, once we have our quotes and our final wrap-up thoughts, we'll have about half an hour of time to network, get a drink. I think there's some mini bagels, as previously mentioned, before we'll come back for our raffle. And that brings us back to the panel. So hopefully everyone saw the quote.
I'm going to get mine over and done with. Mine is really quite pretentious, and I'm kind of upset with myself. But there is an interview with Basquiat where the interviewer asks him, "What are you angry about?" And he kind of like grunts at her and doesn't really say anything. And that is low-key my favourite thing, because it was just like, he just kind of sat there like, what the hell do you mean, woman? I'm angry about everything. Like, what do you mean? And I like the question with the kind of answer of being like, just being so artsy and being so cold about it. I like it. But yeah, it's pretentious and I'm sorry.
Brilliant. Joe?
Yeah, no, gosh, that was, you know, when you're like, you have that dream, we haven't revised for the exam, and then oh God, I can't think of any quotes. So mine's actually is from Harvey Milk, who was like a first gay mayor of San Francisco. Is that correct? No. What? Oh, he wasn't the mayor. Okay, but he was a official in the US, right? And he's just got this quote which I like, where he said, "You cannot live on hope alone, but without hope, life is not worth living." And I think about that a lot, because I'm like, a lot of the time, I don't know, the world can feel a little bit depressing. Newsflash, maybe no one's realised that, but it can feel a bit like the challenges that we are facing are kind of insurmountable and that we can't do anything. I just so sincerely don't believe that, because I just choose not to believe that, because I think, what would my life be worth living if I did believe that? You know, would I get out of bed in the morning? And so I choose to have hope, and that's sort of my philosophy on life. But yeah.
Jack?
Yeah, this is a bit of a different vibe, but there's a remarkable simplicity of this quote, and I wanted to get it up because I didn't want to fuck it up. It's from Rick Muncrief, who's the CEO of an energy company. He said earlier this year, "Our strategy is to stay as oily as we can for as long as we can." I think it's a remarkable simplicity of the logic of fossil capitalism in literally one sentence. So yeah, it's a different angle, but that's something. Yeah.
Jodi-Ann?
I can't give you one single quote, but I'll give you a really good book. Full of great quotes, if you want to read it. New Dark Age by James Bridle. If you want a quote from it, I'll read it for you from Goodreads.
Yeah.
It says, it is on this contradiction that the idea of a new dark age turns, an age in which the value we have placed upon knowledge is destroyed by the abundance of that profitable commodity, and in which we look about ourselves in search of new ways to understand the world. It's a really good book.
Wow. I'll add my own one in as well. Why not? And my one is one I only heard last week. It's the slogan of the Future Leaders Network, and it's quite bad I only heard it last week because I've been working with them for months. But it's, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I just think that's lovely, and it kind of speaks for itself. And that brings us to our final wrap-up. I mean, I was going to ask if you could each give us one person who we should... one thought leader who we should read or check out to learn more about the climate crisis. But I mean, we touched on that a little bit with that. But if you want to give us, in 1 minute, a final wrap-up thought, again, it can be a recommendation, like a book or something like that, just for people to go away with and maybe continue learning about this space. Jodi-Ann?
Not on the climate crisis in particular, but one of my favorite podcasts is A World to Win by Grace Blakely. You might know who that person is as a journalist.
Yeah, it's really good.
I think one of my most favorite podcasts of all time. And also just if you're interested in getting in this space and taking part in various activities, there is the Eco Action Map, which is on a website by the organization. It's called the Youth Climate Collaborative. So if you just Google Youth Climate Collaborative on their website, the first page you'll see an Eco Action Map. It's basically a map of the world, and it's an AI-generated map. It shows you all the local, national, international level action taking place. You can look for London and see what's happening in the next little while and take part in that. I think it's a great tool, and there's a lot coming from this organization that will focus on green jobs or just equal action opportunities.
Amazing. Sylver?
Obviously, I mentioned Samuel Ross before. Not directly sustainable, but he uses craft as more and as a sustainable practice than like straight up being a sustainable designer. But his interest in philosophy and history and how all of those things kind of sit together, just watch an interview of him talk. The man uses words that you're just like, what? How have you snuck granular in there like that? It doesn't belong there, but okay. And then secondly, there's a woman called Rosalind Sinclair who does a lot of, I think she did her PhD and does a lot of research into sustained practice, which is essentially craft that African, Indian, non-European nations had before colonialism and before the Industrial Revolution, how we used to produce in line with the earth and how we had all of these sustained practices that were innately sustainable and innately eco-friendly, but no one was calling it that. It was just the way that people worked and the way that people made things. So Rosalind Sinclair is she's a really interesting woman who's written a lot of books on it, and yeah, she's really inspiring.
Thank you. For mine, I'd say probably anything podcasts or books with Jason Hickel. Really, really fantastic. I mean, helps break down what is the system that we're talking about, how does it operate, how does it function, how does it reproduce itself. I think that's a really good prerequisite for looking at like, how do I plug into this effort to change things. And I guess a more like tangible point, is anyone interested in like campaigns or the sort of research space? There's an organization in London called NEON, the New Economic Organizing Network. And they have a really great mailing list that they send out weekly jobs. So yeah, like all across the UK in a lot of different spaces, but like with this sort of orientation. So I recommend signing up to that.
Thanks, and thank you again for having me on this panel. It's been really wonderful, actually. So yeah, just to really quickly sum up, I guess I want to say two things. The first, I'll talk about jobs first. I think we really need to think about jobs as not like the most important part of our lives, but I do want to very quickly talk about careers as it's kind of the panel, which is that it's just reiterating what I've said, which is that like you can't fixate too much on the job you're doing at the moment. You've got to think about the kind of missions that you want to contribute to and kind of how you can get yourself in a space where you can kind of move closer to those things. It's about leveraging, well, these are also linked in, but like leveraging the network around you, but just kind of reaching out to people and asking to have coffees and just learning as much as you can, and picking up the tasks in your job that are kind of getting you closer to the thing that you want to be doing. I can make a very quick pitch for the civil service working in kind of climate for the government. I just truly do sincerely love. I feel really energised in my job, and it's kind of the first time I've had a job where I'm just like so excited to get to work in the morning, and it honestly feels great. So if anyone ever wants to talk about that, please do just like drop me a message on LinkedIn or something. I'm always happy to get a coffee. That'd be fun. But I want to end on the kind of broader point, which is that like that's a really important thing. It's important to be kind of getting to a point where you're really loving your job, and if you like me, you believe that is a state that you can get to. It really does make it's made my life a lot better, and I've really enjoyed that. But I think the broader point is like I don't want to just fixate on careers. I want to say my kind of like party trick at work is I'm the kind of optimistic person, and it's, I don't know, just a weird quirk of my personality is that I do kind of have that hopeful view on things. Something that I've chosen to do because of kind of how anxious climate and other issues can kind of make me, and I've just said, okay, I'm going to try and create the change that I can in my very short amount of time on Earth. And so that lots of setbacks, but honestly adopting that kind of hopeful mindset, much easier said than done. I know it's a hilariously like twee thing to say, but honestly it's so important to not feel kind of there's nothing that you can do, because we can all contribute in small and large ways, and societally we've overcome huge challenges before, and we just have to overcome this one, otherwise, well, I won't dwell on that, but we can overcome it, and it's by doing it together. So yeah.
Amazing, and I appreciate ending on that message of hope and optimism, which we all need. I will say that all the recommendations, we'll get those and put those in the follow-up email as well as your LinkedIn or contact details to the extent that that's okay. Amazing. Well, thank you, Jodi-Ann, Sylver, Jack, Joe, for speaking on the panel. It's been so interesting, amazing insights, amazing lessons. As I say, I hope you do hang around for the next half hour or so people can come and ask you any questions that they have. And with that, I think we can mingle and network over there and get some food and drink and things. Thanks, everyone.